from ERC to all of you joining us here to Resuscitation 2017 in Freiburg. It's a privilege to chair the first English session in the afternoon, hopefully having some very nice and interesting topics and lectures. To introduce myself, my name is Joachim Schlieber, I'm an Austrian, and I'm chairing the International Course Committee for Immediate Life Support with the ERC, and together with my nice colleague from Sweden,
no, Finland.
Finland, I'm very sorry, I will do my best to make this session a success. One important message for all of you is that we are on live stream, so when we are asking you, if you want to ask some questions, please use the microphones to ask your questions, otherwise the audience on the screens will not be aware of what we are talking about.
And hello everybody, my name is Sanna Hoppu, I'm coming from Finland, I'm a vice chair of Finnish Resuscitation Council and I'm working in EMS system in Tampere University Hospital, and I also hope that you all have very nice congress here in Freiburg. Welcome.
And I'm very happy to introduce our first speaker. It's Marius Georgiou. He's working at the American Medical Center in Cyprus, and much more important, he's kind of the mastermind of the European Restart a Heart Day. I'm very glad to have him with us, and Marius, the stage is yours.
Thank you for the nice words. Dear all, I'm going to talk about what drives blood flow during CPR, and extending the question a little bit, are there any alternatives? I have no conflict of interest to declare directly to this talk, but one of the studies I will present, it was funded by Cyprus Resuscitation Council, and also I'm the Director of External Affairs of the European Resuscitation Council to declare this. So I will be talking about a little bit about the theory of cardiac pump vs the thoracic pump, the alternative mechanism driving blood flow during CPR, some relevant research articles, and I'm going to talk about the recently published study of the effects of the combination of chest compressions and interposed abdominal compressions in a swine model. Well, we know the background, all of us, since 1960, decades of research. Today, no question, high quality chest compression is the most important parameter during CPR, clearly mentioned in the guidelines 2010, 2015, and so forth. So the mechanism driving effective blood flow is the cardiac pump, when the heart is compressed against the sternum and against the spine, and the thoracic pump, when we compress the chest, we increase the intrathoracic pressure, and there is a pressure around the heart which drives the blood outside of the heart like this. So unfortunately, the numbers with the best quality chest compressions is poor. Only 10 to 30% of the cardiac pre-arrest cardiac output, only 20% of the brain blood flow, the coronary blood flow 5 to 15% with the best ever quality chest compressions. We decided to look at the literature, and we have checked in five different areas, not areas, but phases of cardiac arrest, what really drives the blood flow. The phases were chest compression, the chest decompression, active compression and decompression, the ventilation during CPR, and the effect of chest compression in the cerebral blood flow. So I'm not going to get you tired with these tables. These tables, you can see that we divided into the population, the method of determination of the blood flow, whether it was done by echocardiography and so forth, and which phase of cardiac arrest. You can obviously see that both of the pumps work. And we have concluded that thoracic pump affect chest compression-related blood flow during adult CPR, but it seems that chest compression alone may be not sufficient in order for cardiac or the thoracic pump to work and probably positive pressure ventilation may be the key for this. There is still enormous demand to determine what is going on. So I will be talking a little bit about some alternative methods of having and helping driving the blood flow during CPR, talking about interposed abdominal compressions, active compression, decompression, the phased thoracic, compression, decompression, or the four-phase CPR, and the simultaneous ventilation compression. So let's start with interposed abdominal compressions. So abdominal compression, it happens during the relaxation phase of chest compression. It is priming the heart, it is priming the intrathoracic pump before systole, before the next chest compression. So it's kind of an abdominal pump mechanism, and it sort of works like the intra-aortic balloon pump. What we don't know is that the force, how much force we need to put, and exactly where to exert the interposed abdominal compressions. This is how it happens. It definitely needs, when applied, two persons. One compress the chest, and when during recoil of the chest, the other one compress the abdomen. It has been investigated some time ago, and we see that obviously the interposed abdominal compressions, so together with the chest compressions, it shows high levels of end-tidal CO2. We know today that end-tidal CO2 it is a serious determinant of good quality chest compressions. In another study, they have investigated more and looked at the 24-hour survival, the return of spontaneous circulation, the survival to hospital discharge, and the neurologic intact survival. So here, obviously, there is statistical significance of the survival to hospital discharge. The same author later on claims that interposed abdominal compressions are poorly advertised in the scientific community, even though there is sound physiological basis that improves hemodynamics. When used in hospital cardiac arrest, there is statistical significance if compared with standard CPR. Well, there is more about it. This study, it is done as an animal study, and it looks in only rhythmic abdominal compressions, so no chest compressions, and it measures in these swine models the minute ventilation and the coronary perfusion pressure. It shows that only rhythmic abdominal compressions produces very good volumes when the rate goes down and the force increases. Here it compares with chest compression only CPR, and obviously the standard CPR, you can see that is more minute alveolar ventilation. And also you can see the difference here in coronary perfusion pressure. So only rhythmic, only abdominal compressions generated good ventilatory volumes, good coronary perfusion pressures, but this study haven't looked at the survival. This study later on tell us that this is an animal study again done in Athens, and it compares standard chest compressions with interposed abdominal compressions. doesn't have much difference. So if you look at the studies, the comparable studies, probably 50%, there is a 50% increase of the hemodynamics, or 37% increase in the coronary perfusion pressure. Nevertheless, the survival studies with interposed abdominal compressions, they haven't produced any consistent results. Another way of driving or helping the blood flow during CPR is, again, something you already know. There are a lot of devices outside there, is the active compression decompression CPR. It's a suction cup device. It primes the thoracic pump again, and it makes greater chest expansion because it actively compresses and actively decompresses, creating a negative intrathoracic pressure, and augments the venous return, augments the preload before the chest compression, the next chest compression, and also increases the minute ventilation. I'm not going to stay any further on this, but we know that this is a big meta-analysis. The active compression decompression devices, they produce significant difference in return of spontaneous circulation, but not significant difference in the survival. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the 4-phase CPR, the phase thoracic, abdominal compression, decompression CPR. It's a method that combines both. It combines interposed abdominal compressions and also combines the active compression decompression. So this is, it happens in 4 phases. It originally investigated with this thing which is called live stick. One goes in the thorax, the other one goes in the abdomen. This is how it really happens. Phase 1, chest compression, and at the same time, active decompression of the abdomen. Phase 2. Phase 3, active decompression of the chest and active compression of the abdomen. So that's why it's called 4-phase CPR. In a mathematical model, they compared in this study the interposed abdominal compression, the active compression decompression, and the combination, the 4-phase CPR. So obviously there are better hemodynamics with the combination. There is the mean systemic perfusion pressure generated, it's much better. You can see here in the systemic perfusion pressure scale. Few words about the timing of the ventilation or the simultaneous ventilation and compression. This is again from the group of Athens. They have looked in swine models again the timing of the pressure ventilation during chest compression, and they concluded that the proper timing of compression and ventilation may actually improve the circulation. And here is a graph from this study showing that there's several phases of ventilation, and here you can see how the thoracic pump is increased with this study. Okay, I'll be presenting this study, which was recently published in American Journal of Emergency Medicine. It's the combination of chest compression and interposed abdominal compressions in a swine model of ventricular fibrillation. It is a 4-phase CPR. Our aim was to investigate the effects of this combination, the active compression and decompression of both chest and abdomen in a swine model. The specific aims were to look as a primary outcome the ROSC, and as a secondary outcome the 48-hour survival and the 48-hour neurologic outcome. Of course, we've been measuring all these hemodynamic parameters. It was a controlled experimental design study in a swine model. The study intervention was the interposed abdominal compressions. The control was standard CPR, 4 cycles of CPR. So 20 healthy pigs, 20 healthy piglets, similar age and weight, randomized in 2 groups. Group A, the control, Group B, the intervention group. Stabilization phase, putting the lines and so forth, about 30 minutes, induced ventricular fibrillation with a battery of cadmium, and 8 minutes, we let the piglets untreated of CPR. We have been ventilating them when we started with 100% of oxygen at the rate of 10 per minute. And we have used 2 Lucases, two of these devices. You can probably see outside, one in the abdomen, one in the chest, being synchronized as I showed you in the diagram before. So the post-ROSC monitoring was maintained for 6 hours, and the endpoint, as I said, ROSC and 48 survival. So venous and arterial catheters were measuring hemodynamic parameters. The neurological alertness score has been previously validated here. And the assessor was blinded, the assessor of this score. The results, there were no differences on the baseline and no differences when we measuring the parameters during the 8 minutes of untreated VF. We have seen differences, but no statistical differences in ROSC with chest compression and interposed abdominal compressions, 9/1 not ROSC, and the standard CPR 6/4. We have seen some differences in the first cycle, in 2 minutes, second and third cycle, when we've been measuring the systolic aortic pressure, the right atrium systolic pressure, diastolic pressure, mean arterial pressure, coronary perfusion pressure, and end-tidal CO2. Here are the differences in both groups. We see that there is, in the first cycle, there is a statistical difference in systolic aortic pressure and coronary perfusion pressures. When ROSC, we have observed that there is significant difference in coronary perfusion pressure. So after ROSC, those that they have ROSC, they have better coronary perfusion pressure. 2 hours after ROSC, they were significantly different in systolic aortic pressure and diastolic aortic pressure. Although there were no statistically significance in ROSC, because probably of the small sample, there were statistically significant in the neurological outcome. There are definitely better hemodynamics there, but there is no effect on the cardiac output. In contrast, there is better cardiac output with humans, probably because the piglets, they have less venous pool. We have seen this as the effect of the abdominal pump. It seems that it enhances both thoracic and cardiac pump. This is in relation with some other studies. Oops, sorry. With other studies from the group of Athens, that it increases venous return. The pressure on the abdominal aorta, it seems that it promotes retrograde volume loading of the aorta. That's why the diastolic aortic pressure is increased, and the coronary perfusion pressure is also increased. The right atrial diastolic pressure after the second cycle is increased, probably because of the venous return, and there is, after some time, myocardial stunning also, and it's also same results in those studies here. So there was better neurological outcome compared to standard CPR. We believe it's because of the earlier return of spontaneous circulation, which alleviated the post-resuscitation brain injury. We believe also it's because of the active compression-decompression that it was applied, and that augments the negative intrathoracic pressure. We also believe it is due to the retrograde volume loading of the aorta that is enhancing also the cerebral perfusion pressure, which probably this might be an explanation of why the neurological outcome could be better. Also, for better neurological outcome, we see that there is less transmission of intrathoracic pressure to the intracranial space during compression. That's why better perfusion. If it's less pressure in the brain and better hemodynamics, better mid-arterial pressure, that means that the brain perfusion pressure, it's better. I'm not here to sell you anything. I'm not here to tell you that we go out there and we start using the interposed abdominal compression or the combination or whatsoever. There are some limitations of this study and of the other studies also. The sample study was small. The experiment was conducted apparently in healthy pigs, and body temperature and critical care data during 48 hours after ROSC could also work as co-founders on neurologic outcome. Conclusion, interposed abdominal compression improves hemodynamics during CPR. This is a fact. Improves coronary perfusion pressure. That is a parameter that we know from a lot of other studies detects ROSC and survival. It proves neurological outcome. This is a finding, and could be applied as a primary technique immediately after cardiac arrest, while resuscitation efforts should continue with standard CPR later on. So we see more effects in the first 2 cycles. So it might be an option. And finally, there are 3 major mechanisms of blood flow: the thoracic pump, the cardiac pump, which happens when we do chest compression, and also here what we see is the retrograde aortic volume loading, which could be defined as abdominal pump. And I will give you some ideas for further research to increase the reliability of these experiments. Could be replicated probably in another animal species, ideally in humans, and cerebral perfusion flow could be measured, the cerebral saturation in other future similar studies, measure the ICP, the intracranial pressure, and try look at different weight and depth of interposed abdominal compression. Also, blood can be checked for neurospecific NOLAS or S100 and or lactic acid in different timings. Thank you for your attention.
Marius, thank you very much also for staying in time, which allows us to have a discussion. Therefore, I would like to ask if there are really immediate questions. I will allow 1 to 3, and all together, after all talks, we will have a short wrap-up of all the lectures. So that's the plan. Are there any questions at the moment? If yes, please go to the microphone. Yeah, the one in the middle.
Yes, thank you very much for this interesting presentation. I was wondering, the ERC chose not to recommend this technique to use it standardly. Do you disagree with the recommendation?
Not at all. I don't disagree with the recommendation because it has a long way to go until there is much evidence to prove that it should be applied or to prove it should not be applied. So I definitely do not disagree that is not recommended today.
Okay, and the second question I had is, I wondered what your opinion is about the head-up CPR. There's some animal experiments that showed increase in cardiac output produced by basic life support when you place the patient with the head-up position.
Well, I think it's the same idea. Oh, you mean the head-up position?
Yes. It was not a subject of your talk, but
I have read. I mean, I have came through legs up, and my mind goes to when legs up, priming of the intrathoracic pump again, and better preload before the chest compressions. I'm not much aware of the mechanism of how the head up can affect the cerebral perfusion pressure. I would assume that it would be worse. I don't know.
Thank you.
Okay, I do not see anyone else trying to ask the next question, so it's a pleasure to thank Marius for this presentation and to hand over to my nice co-chair.
Thank you. Thank you. And I'm very happy to introduce our next speaker. He is Calvin Perkins. Calvin Perkins is a professor of critical care medicine. He is co-chairing ILCOR and has been more or less involved for guideline processes for almost 20 years already. Please welcome.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction and for the opportunity to speak here. So the focus of my talk over the course of the next 20 minutes or so is compression-only CPR. Is it good or is it bad? By way of conflicts of interest, I have no commercial conflicts of interest on this topic. My academic conflicts come from my involvement with the International Liaison for Committee, European Resuscitation Council and Resuscitation Council UK, who have variously been involved in evaluating the science and publishing clinical guidelines that apply the scientific evidence into practice. So we'll start off with a slide that I'm sure many people here have seen before that starts to put compressions and ventilations into context. And I guess as I go through the talk, this is to clarify that alongside the importance of compressions or ventilations, whatever you choose to do, deliver it with the highest possible quality. Now, in terms of providing a framework and a structure for this talk, it's quite timely that this talk has come into the programme, as the International Liaison Committee on Resuscitation has indeed recently reviewed the science relating to compression-only CPR versus compression and ventilation as part of a pilot test of the new continuous evidence evaluation process. Because not large amounts of the literature have changed since this talk may have been done at previous conferences, I thought I'd spend a few moments on just describing the new continuous evidence evaluation process, at least at a headline level, so that people are aware how science will be coming to the clinical community as we move into the years ahead. For people that want to find out more information about the ILCOR continuous evidence evaluation and to actually receive some tutorial talks on this, then there is a evidence evaluation masterclass that is occurring later in the programme that I'd encourage you to have a look at. And I know Ian McConaughey, Jerry Nolan and Laurie Morrison are going to be delivering some excellent training sessions there. So this is the evidence evaluation process, and ILCOR has moved from a batch and queue style review of evidence where we would review things towards a 5-year goal of publishing a 5-year consensus on science and treatment recommendation. We've come to realise that science changes much more rapidly than every 5 years, and with the advent of mobile technology and the way that people access clinical information has changed, that the speed and pace with which we need to keep up to date with evidence is changing as we proceed through the 21st century. So as opposed to bundling things up and presenting them on a 5-year basis, there'll be a continual stream of evidence, consensus on science and treatment recommendations that will come out periodically through the year. And as I'll guide you to in a future slide, the ILCOR website will contain the relevant information. But to just briefly summarise the process, the cartoon over on the slide there at the bottom left is a description of the PICO question. So identify the population, the intervention, the comparator and the outcomes. There's then a process of assimilating and pulling the evidence together that's assessed using a grade methodology and then summarised as a consensus on science and put forward as a treatment recommendation that can then be taken forward by national and regional resuscitation councils into clinical practice guidelines. One of the new styles with the ILCOR approach to evidence evaluation is the involvement of professional evidence reviewers. If we look back, as our chair introduced, as someone that's played a part in the evidence evaluation process over time, in the early days it was very much clinicians and people that were novice at evidence evaluation feeding into the process. The 2015 going forwards process involves the use of expert and specifically trained and funded systematic reviewers to support the evidence evaluation process. Where there's a very simple question, perhaps just one intervention, that type of work would be done by an expert systematic reviewer. Where we have more complex questions, and this is an example of a more complex question, because although compression versus ventilation is a relatively simple concept, actually the context within which that intervention will be delivered turns this into a complex question with a number of different subsections. And those more complex questions are dealt with by an expert knowledge synthesis unit. And these are professional organisations that work for governments and societies, synthesising clinical evidence and summarising them as consensus on science. And as I'll allude to through the talk, we then have the expert input of the task force and the members of the International Liaison Committee for Resuscitation. So because this was deemed as a more complex question, then the first pilot took place with the St Michael's Knowledge Synthesis Unit under the guidance of Andrea Trico and the leadership of Huda Ashur, who undertook a comprehensive review of the effectiveness of cardiopulmonary resuscitation. Now, just moving forward to this slide, and again, I'm not going to go through and read out the great detail in this, but it really summarises the evidence synthesis journey. Now, with the ILCOR questions, ILCOR is setting the research question, the so-called PICO, and deciding the eligibility criteria before the knowledge synthesis unit then undertake a literature search. And as you can see here, they plan the search, perform the search, and then pilot and evaluate the results of the search and undertake a detailed process where they screen all of the articles on one occasion, and then they bring it to the clinical reference group for expert input, and then repeat the screening a second time, and then they'll abstract the data and then summarise the data. Where it's appropriate, a meta-analysis is undertaken in light of clinical and statistical heterogeneity, and if it's relevant, they'll perform a meta-analysis. They are capable of undertaking more complex analyses, such as network meta-analyses, which is where you can take an intervention from a number of different studies and pool all of the data together that allow cross-comparisons between studies that might not otherwise be possible. The results are then synthesized and a manuscript is presented, and the manuscript presents the summary of science, and that is then passed on to ILCOR, who turn it into a consensus on science and treatment recommendations. So for this first ILCOR question, there are actually 6 subgroups that the knowledge synthesis unit address, because compression to ventilation ratios, or compression only versus compression with ventilation, is applied in a number of different contexts, and it's important to not pool the data but to consider them separately. So we'd considered dispatcher assisted, adult and pediatric bystander CPR, compression to ventilation ratios, EMS-delivered CPR, and in-hospital resuscitation. And this information is summarised and available on the ilcor.org website. So it's not shown in this presentation as I'm not online, but you can click on each of these hyperlinks and it will take you to the relevant consensus on science and treatment recommendation. I can move through this slide fairly quickly as I've just read out this information to you, but there were really 6 areas that we looked at, and that will form the background really to the remainder of the presentation. So we were fortunate that the systematic review was completed. It took about 9 months of hard work from the knowledge synthesis unit, with support of the scientific or the clinical experts, myself and Alan Declan, and we were pleased the article was published a few weeks ago in Resuscitation. I think it's probably worth noting the large number of authors on the paper, which reflects the number of people working within the knowledge synthesis unit that have been involved in the evidence evaluation process. So this is a flow chart, a systematic review flow chart that, again, people are probably familiar with, where it identifies the number of records that were identified by the search strategy. So just over 5,500 records. These records were all screened, which took a substantial amount of time for the knowledge synthesis unit. And they then identified 229 papers that were then reviewed in detail as full text. This then led to a final pool of 28 papers, of which there were 13 comparator or companion papers. And as I'll come to across some of the slides, one of the challenges, particularly where one's looking at registry data, is that a registry may publish the same or a similar research question using the same pool of data, and at times there can be overlap. So to avoid double counting, you need to very carefully map how each of the registry studies has interplayed with the others, how it's referenced to contemporary clinical practice guidelines, and whether there's any overlap of patients between that and another publication. And then the clinical team need to decide which of those are going to be the things that are actually included in the final meta-analysis. Again, not to go into a huge amount of detail, but to emphasize the depth of these systematic reviews. Each of them is assessed using the Cochrane risk of bias tool for randomized controlled trials, as you can see here. And there were relatively few randomized controlled trials. In fact, only 3 individual patient randomized trials and 1 cluster randomized trial conducted in the US, and detailed risk assessments for the risk of bias were undertaken and are summarized here. But you can see for the randomized controlled trials, which always represent the higher quality evidence, on the whole, the quality of the evidence was moderate to high. Moving to the lower tier of evidence, observational studies, there were 23 observational studies, and with the exception of the adequacy of follow-up of cohorts, the risk of bias was on the low to moderate side, accepting that any observational study, because of the risk of confounding, is going to be at risk of bias. So just walking through the summary of science, and then I'll take you to the task force treatment recommendation and the values and preferences, is that dispatcher-assisted compression-only CPR comprised 3 randomized controlled trials comprising several thousand patients, and the majority of them compared a 15:2 to continuous chest compressions. And one can see here from the forest plot that the point estimate is to the right, indicating that compression-only CPR is better. It's worth noting that only one of the trials looked at favourable neurological outcome. These were the data for survival to 30 days or discharge. And that trial showed no overall difference, although the direction and still favoured compression-only CPR, as was true also for return of spontaneous circulation. I guess the richness to add to the context is that when one's undertaking a systematic review, it's often difficult to get some of the contextual information, and that's really where the value of them working with a task force and the international scientific experts can really draw the literature together in the context of clinical practice and where the studies were done. So in fact, these 3 studies were both randomized trials. As you can see, the ratio was 15 to 2, and now most places would teach 30 to 2. And the inclusion criteria restricted to patients that had a presumed cardiac cause. So the application of these guidelines, or at least the evidence synthesis, needs to be taken in context. And I think that's where the treatment recommendation, and in particular the values and preferences statement from the task force were of particular value. So the conclusion of the task force deliberations were to recommend that dispatchers provide instructions to perform continuous chest compressions, i.e. compression-only CPR, to callers for adults with suspected out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. And that was a strong recommendation given the consistency of the studies and indeed the difficulty of trying to teach somebody that's naive to performing CPR how to perform ventilations. And some of that is captured in the values and preferences section as indicated here. So the task force placed high value on the initiation of bystander CPR, noting that there's a significant risk or that one of the barriers to CPR is mouth-to-mouth contact. They place a higher value on performing CPR on patients that are in cardiac arrest than the risks of doing so for patients that aren't in cardiac arrest. Whilst noting the variable quality of evidence across the whole literature of dispatcher-assisted CPR, it was clear that it was very difficult to instruct bystanders to perform ventilations over a telephone if they'd not had the opportunity to do so. And indeed, I know Charles Deacon, who's in the audience, has done some really compelling work involving video footage showing quite how difficult it is to train someone that's naive to CPR how to perform ventilations. So the literature consistently favours telephone CPR protocols that use compression only in that it leads to a better uptake, it leads to a quicker start to CPR, and it leads to more compressions being delivered in the first few minutes of cardiac arrest. So with So with the literature presented or of the questions tackled, I think probably the most consistent evidence comes in that regard. Now, telephone CPR is relevant in systems that are set up to allow the dispatcher to prompt telephone CPR, and indeed ourselves, ILCOR and the ERC strongly advocate systems should include prompts to initiate telephone CPR. But one also needs to consider what to train bystanders if you're preparing them for an event. So stepping aside from people that are untrained to giving some thought to in practice if people have the ability to perform compressions and ventilations, which way does the evidence point us? And again, I'm not going to go into the detail of these forest plots and these studies, other than to note that they were all observational studies, and so all such studies have a risk of confounding, and there's also a risk that clinical practice changes for other reasons over time. So the concept of compression-only CPR is a relatively new concept, perhaps something that's been advocated for the last 5, 6 or 7 years. And so if one's looking to compare compressions and ventilations, then there's likely to have been a shift in time, as it's now more likely that people will do compression-only CPR for an out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. As you can see from the forest plots, that the studies generally compared 15:2 to continuous chest compressions, and none of the forest plots showed a significant difference between compressions and ventilations. And again, it's worth noting some of the richness of the context of these studies is that many of them restricted analyses to patients that had a presumed cardiac cause. So it specifically excluded patients that had an asphyxial cause of their cardiac arrest. So again, taking that information in context, the task force continue to recommend that chest compressions are performed for all patients in cardiac arrest. And they go on to suggest that those that are trained, able and willing to give rescue breaths as well as chest compression should do so for all patients in cardiac arrest. And I guess thinking back, and we'll hear later on from Douglas Chamberlain, but thinking back to the concept of bronze, silver and gold CPR, it's about delivering a layered approach to resuscitation with making sure that people do something that is achievable and graspable as the first step, and then adding the icing on the cake of ventilations when trained to do so. The values and preferences strongly endorse the 2010 and the 2015 consensus on science that we really should be advocating for chest compressions to be performed on all patients that sustain an out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. As I've alluded to, it's simpler to teach and can be taught as part of a tiered sequence. The literature suggests that there may be potential additional benefits of conventional CPR when delivered by trained laypersons, particularly in the setting where the EMS response intervals are going to be long and for asphyxial causes of cardiac arrest. Moving on to paediatric compression-only CPR. Of course, paediatrics had to be different and special, as they often allude to us. And I'll explain why I've made that statement in a moment. The Knowledge Synthesis Unit undertook a review of studies that included children, and where possible, it extracted the cohorts of children if it reported both children and adults. So at the time of the analysis, there were 2 cohort studies, both from the Japanese registry, and both pointed to better neurological outcome in children between the age of 1 and 17 with CPR that included ventilation. So outcomes were worse with compression-only CPR, and that was also true in the Goto study. And the same thing with survival. So worse neurological outcome and worse survival. Now, I say, of course, paediatrics have to be different, and it's actually to commend the paediatric community for the great steps they've gone in the last few years in terms of increasing the amount of evidence that's related to paediatrics. And so rather than simply taking adult data, the amount of paediatric specific information is increasing. And these 2 studies have both been published and suggest that doing something is better than doing nothing, so either compression only or conventional CPR. And in their adjusted analyses in this study, which again was a Japanese study, suggested that there was no difference between continuous and compression only. But that wasn't true in the US CARES data, which again an observational study with the bias and confounding that such studies have, showing, as you can probably see quite clearly graphically, survival to hospital discharge and neurological favourable survival was better if you combined compressions with ventilations. So the treatment recommendation steers you towards providing CPR with ventilations, although if you're unable to do ventilations, it's better to do something than to do nothing. Compression to ventilation ratio is a nice, simple and I think positive message that reinforces current practice, and that's in the studies that compared compression to ventilation ratios of 15:2 to 30:2 consistently showed improvements in favourable neurological outcome, which is here, survival to discharge, which is here, and an inconsistent effect, although a small number of studies, in return of spontaneous circulation. So the guideline changed back in 2005, which in fairness was bundled with some other guideline changes. The literature has consistently suggested that that leads to better outcomes. So we suggest a compression to ventilation ratio of 30:2 is better than any other ratio that has been studied to date. And that recommendation is consistent with previous recommendations, and it's likely to lead to a consistent number of lives being saved as opposed to lower ratios. The task force is also very cognizant that any change in clinical practice guidelines are also going to lead to knock-on effects in terms of education and reprogramming of equipment, and so consistency with current recommendations was also a driver for the task force. Moving to the last but one summary, which again, this is just a couple of slides, and to give you some idea of the complexity. EMS delivered CPR. There are a number of varieties of EMS CPR that have been studied. There's continuous chest compressions represented by the top line here, with the blue representing chest compressions. There's continuous chest compressions with asynchronous ventilations, so do the chest compressions and give the ventilations on top with or without a protected airway. There's then the concept of minimally interrupted chest compressions, where a series of chest compressions, potentially up to 200, are given before ventilations are then provided. And then there's our traditional 30-2 or 15-2 interrupted. And all of these have been studied under the context of different styles of EMS CPR. And I think again, not to go into the detail here, but to highlight this really as an outstanding study from the Resuscitation Outcome Consortium, nearly 25,000 patients randomized in this EMS study, which compared continuous chest compressions with asynchronous ventilations with interrupting chest compressions to deliver ventilations, and found no overall difference in any of the survival outcomes. And the same was true for the two observational cohort studies. So the overarching recommendation, to be consistent with other guidelines, that prior to undertaking a definitive airway, ILCOR recommends EMS providers perform 30 compressions to 2 ventilations. Again, being cognizant of the impact of changing international guidelines can have on practice, there are a number of EMS systems that have developed minimally interrupted cardiac resuscitation that in the specific cohorts of patients with shockable rhythms and those with a cardiac cause of cardiac arrest, are going to, there appears to be no obvious difference, and so it's reasonable for those systems to continue with those approaches. In-hospital CPR is very simple. There was a single study identified. It used a mechanical CPR device and it applied it to out-of-hospital cardiac arrest patients that had arrived in the emergency department, and so really quite indirect evidence. But to be consistent with other recommendations, undertake 30-2 prior to securing the airway, and continuous chest compressions with asynchronous ventilations once the airway is secured. And I think the values and preferences follow the same generic principles as with previous studies. So the last couple of slides, I guess, are to reflect on the evidence evaluation process. And I think, as you've hopefully seen from the amount and the depth of data that was produced, that we really did benefit from the skills and expertise of a knowledge synthesis unit to take a lot of a combination of the donkey work or the leg work of identifying the studies and synthesizing all of that information together. But then that did lead to a large group of co-authors and collaborators. The key things that we learned along the way was the importance of getting the question right, ensuring that the task force were involved throughout the process, and really the value of the consensus on science and treatment recommendation to providing context to what otherwise can be quite a dry synthesis of evidence. Value for money, I think, will be a question that ILCOR addresses, because the work of a team of 15 or 20 people in a knowledge synthesis unit isn't something that comes cheaply. So to conclude the topic as a whole, all patients who sustain a cardiac arrest where resuscitation is viable should receive chest compressions. I believe that ventilations will add value. That's especially true in children, and I think it's likely to also be true in non-cardiac causes and where there's a delayed response. Whether you do continuous chest compressions or compressions with ventilation, although not touched upon in this review, I'd emphasize the importance of minimizing interruptions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Calvin, for excellent speak. Okay. Now we have time for a few questions from the audience. Please come up to the microphone. Well, I think it was a very excellent speak because nothing to ask any longer. Well, I have maybe one. Do you think that more lay persons get CPR when ventilations are not needed?
So do I think more lay people receive?
I mean that. Do you think that more cardiac arrest persons get more CPR from lay persons if not ventilations are not needed?
Yes, so I do think that ventilation, particularly if you're doing it as a dispatch, is a barrier to people taking up CPR. And I think it's reflected in the treatment recommendations that we say do chest compressions for everybody. And then if you're almost willing and able, there's added value from doing ventilations. But it's better that people do something rather than people do nothing. Thank you.
Yes, I think so too. Thank you.
Yeah. I would like to introduce Josh Shore from United Kingdom, who is at the moment the chair of the ALS working group through European Resuscitation Council, and he's an excellent researcher also in basic life support, and I'm very interested to hear your talk, Josh. Welcome.
Thank you very much. So, first of all, thank you for inviting me to the meeting. I'm going to speak about adjuncts to improve CPR effectiveness. I have no conflicts of interest on this topic, but I do have personal opinions. So all the opinions are my own, and where I've chosen an opinion, I'll support it with the science I think is best for it. So I've not done any fancy systematic reviews. It's all opinions. So I wasn't quite sure what the title meant by adjuncts, supplementary rather than essential things to improve, to help make better. CPR, we all know, effectiveness, success in producing a desired result. So success to me is saving a life, having a living, alive person who goes back to work or back to their family, back to being a mother, a parent, or a child. So I'm going to give you some thoughts on how we achieve this. And I thought I'd go back to some older experts from a long time ago and see what they had to say. So I found an Italian and I found a German, and they came up with some useful advice. You know, you've got to have urgency of doing. You've got to know what is enough, you've got to apply, and you've got to be willing to do enough and must do. And they are the key things. You know, it's all about implementation. And so, in our ideal world, we'd have great science, great education, great implementation, lots of survivors. And our equation would all be 10 out of 10. 1 times 1 times 1 equals 100% survival. In real life, you know, I've probably overrated this. I've said science, we're 8 out of 10, 0.8. We're probably not. You know, education, most people don't know CPR in most countries. Implementation, you know, we're probably not that great. And we score 10% survivals, you know, and we could change those numbers, but the bottom line is only 1 in 10 people at best who have out-of-hospital cardiac arrest and CPR survive. So how are we going to improve this, and what adjuncts do we need? And to me, the simplest adjuncts are going to be in education and implementation. And what's more important is to make that as simple as possible. I don't know, because no one's done the science or published the papers, how many people do you need to train to save 1 life? And I suspect it's several thousand. So you've got to get your education as efficient as possible, that because most people you save are never going to ever need to do CPR. So to me, the next big move would be combining the education and implementation into one. So people just learn enough to need what they need to know to save a life. They don't need to learn too much, they don't need to carry too much information with them, and they don't need to carry a lot of kit with them. You know, so if you can combine 2 things in that equation, you already treble the chance of survival just by improving education implementation. So this is sort of system thinking. And if you go further and you look at things that rely on humans tend to be less effective. So if one of your residents makes a mistake, most people go, well, you need to read the book, or you need to try harder and be smarter, or do something. Well, the truth is that you really want to remove as many human factors as you can and sort of just make things automatic. So more effective interventions are simplification, standardization, and forcing functions. So most people who drove here or came on public transport got here because, the arrows all point in the right direction and things just force you to do the right thing. So how are we going to apply that to the chain of survival? And we've got to think, who are our target groups? So to me, our target groups for the first 3 links is everybody. So we've got to teach everybody how to recognize cardiac arrest, call for help, start chest compressions, and we've got to train most people to use an AED. In fact, we could probably increase that. We need to train everybody in how to use an AED. And that leaves a very small role for the experts in what to do next. And so we've got to have interventions or adjuncts that get a lot of people calling for help, starting chest compressions, giving a shock. And the other thing we've got to remember is, to do that, it's got to be very simple. So school children can do it, anybody can do it, as opposed to more complex things. And finally, the slam dunk for me is that it's got to be early. And one of the problems with a lot of the interventions that we do, so drugs, tracheal intubation, all the fancy ALS stuff, tends to come late. And so it's early, simple interventions that are going to score most points. So I'm going to just concentrate on my talk on systems approaches to lead to effective CPR. One more slide, and you'll see why I'm doing this. So if you imagine you've got efficacy there, implementation there. Things are easy to do. In my opinion, we should just get on and do them, irrespective of the efficacy. Things that are difficult to do and have low efficacy or even high, we need to think a bit more about. So we should be aiming for easy things. So I just made this graph and I just thought, and not everybody would agree with me, but I've used it before. So, Gavin's just done a talk on compression-only CPR. In fact, these two are, it's easy to do, its efficacy is okay. In fact, AEDs, high efficacy, relatively easy to do. Things like ECMO on my graph would be somewhere up here. Mechanical CPR wouldn't even get on my graph, because efficacy is equivalent, but it arrives late. Impedance threshold device. So most of these adjuncts don't tend to get on these graphs, or they're in a bit of a graph where there's difficulty because it's not readily available, doesn't get there on time, and most people are never going to have it available when someone has a cardiac arrest. We're not going to put mechanical CPR devices in every house, every street, etc. And seconds count. So what does that leave us with? Now I'm going to do a straw poll. Who has an AED? Who has a mobile phone on them? Excellent. Who has 2 hands? Excellent. And who knows where the nearest AED is? It's somewhere just out here. So this is all we need. So I've ruled out most of the other stuff. And all the other and then we've got to make marginal gains. So lots of small gains will give us improvement over time. And to me, the big gains are going to be in things like using, oops, I've gone the wrong way. There. Getting the AED there faster, and not with sort of fancy, expensive technology that works and does what it's meant to do, but arrives late. Clearly, if you're in hospital or you have a witnessed arrest and you're the EMS and you have all this kit, you can use it. But for the masses, a lot of this kit isn't going to be there. So let's go back to our chain of survival. The ERC BLS working group sort of added in the concept of the dispatcher, to give instructions and to locate the AED. But the first part of the chain is actually the most challenging in that people struggle to identify cardiac arrest. And if you ever watch videos of people arresting, it often takes quite a long time for people to realize there's a problem. And it's because we have all these issues that the person's doing. You know, they may be fitting, they may be doing shallow breaths, gasping, they may be doing eye opening, and that sort of puts people off from starting. And I've watched quite a few videos of people having cardiac arrest in my time, and often there's quite a long delay between anybody noticing there's a problem, and yeah, minutes. So that's our first challenge. And then once people have recognized the cardiac arrest, we know that if the dispatcher doesn't recognize the cardiac arrest, survival is worse. So the importance of the first link makes a big difference. And then starting CPR also makes a big difference. So if there's no bystander CPR, you get a threefold less chance of survival. So we need to start doing interventions that shorten the time from recognition to starting CPR. And again, there's more evidence that even 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60-second differences make big differences in the chances of survival. And that's where campaigns come in for training. So the ERC Restart a Heart Day, getting children early. So this is my son and daughter, and I got them trained up very early. In fact, whenever my 5-year-old is in the park, even if someone's sunbathing, he'll sort of go over and have a look. So I've had to sort of train him now on more ways of, it's not just laying there asleep, but training your children to do CPR, using interactive gaming, short videos. And this is something which I'm going to tell you about, but I know Andrew Lockie's going to talk about further, and there's a session on this, using other forms. So the Resuscitation Council in the UK has just produced a virtual reality training, and I know the Italians and the others have done the same. So this is sort of a download that you can just put in a cardboard box and be immersed in a scenario. So you can be in a room saving someone's life, and whether you do that on a mannequin or a pillow. We know this is important because data from Sweden, and this is over 20 years, the more people they trained, which is the red line, the more bystander CPR they got. And we know that bystander CPR trebles the chances of survival. So, Professor Perkins said hands-only CPR was okay, so that's good enough. So you need people dialing 112 or 999 or whatever the local number is, starting chest compressions, and that requires training, lots of people. And I'm not going to give a talk on training, but simple, fun training would probably be good enough for me. If it's a 1-minute TV ad, a 10-minute video game, a half-an-hour game, whatever it takes to get people interested. The next link is defibrillation. And in most cardiac arrests, the defibrillator never gets there. So I've got some UK data from Charles Deakin and colleagues in Southampton. They looked at cardiac arrests in their area. So they looked at 135 cardiac arrests, or 1,035. An AED was retrieved in about 4%, but only less than 2% had the AED used or attached before the ambulance arrived. And in most of these cases, there would have been, in quite a lot of them, there was an AED nearby. So why is that? And it's part of that because of training. People aren't aware of the AEDs. But one reason, and we've done in the UK, we've done polling and we've done surveys, we've looked at the signage. And I think, and a lot of people are beginning to think, that this sign puts people off. Having a lightning bolt is not a good idea because it looks too much like, and it's off-putting. It's like, this is dangerous, this is not for us, or we need training to use this. So the current sign that people are encouraged to use may be the wrong sign. And colleagues at the Resuscitation Council, led by Chris Smith, we did 2 big surveys looking at 2,000 people. Most people didn't recognize the current sign. You know, if you showed them that, they said, oh, that means danger. They didn't really link it with saving a life. And then we showed them lots of variations on signs and what wording they prefer. Most people prefer the term heart restarter, or defibrillation is too medical. So we might like it because we're all healthcare professionals, but the people who know nothing about a defibrillator, it's a technical term. They want more simple terms. And from this work, we trialled lots of signs. And the output is that in the UK now, the Resuscitation Council and the British Heart Foundation have brought out these new posters and signs that we're encouraging people to use to identify defibrillators for use. And we're also encouraging that no training is required. And so if you look at the specific wording, anyone can use it, no training necessary. And not everybody agrees with that, but clearly if you turn it on and follow the instructions, you should be able to deliver a shock. And also, fortunately for me, it does talk about the phone, hands, and an AED, which were the 3 important adjuncts that I highlighted earlier on. So that's one important simple adjunct, just, you know, getting defib manufacturers and people to change a sign. And clearly in the UK, there's hundreds of those lightning bolt signs, thousands of them, and it'll take a long time to change. But hopefully over time, people will start pulling them down and putting a more permissive or encouraging sign up. This is more work from Charles Deakin. So his ambulance service has mapped all the AEDs in his region, and clearly the ambulance dispatcher can also now tell people where the nearest AED is. And there's lots of apps on this. So there's an app that's used in London that's now growing globally called Good Sam. There's also Pulse Point, and there's several other apps where people can be alerted or they can be told where the nearest AED is. And the challenge for these apps is integrating them with the ambulance service. So when you ring the ambulance dispatcher, from your location, they can tell you where the nearest available working AED is. So that's something that clearly is a systems approach. And just to show it does work, so this is a study from Sweden where the bystander CPR rate increased from 48% to 62% when they used a mobile phone alerting system for people who'd volunteered to be first responders and used, you know, dispatching lay people. So again, increasing the bystander CPR rate increased with using a mobile application. I did mention drones. So again, lots of work is going on in drones. This is a Swedish study again where they've looked at if they sighted drones in remote areas, they could get an AED very rapidly to rescuers so they could use it in an emergency. So all this technology is going to trump small devices that individuals have. So a systems approach from ambulance services, mapping AEDs, etc., is where I think the big wins are going to be in CPR effectiveness. Now, this weekend, I'll just tell you, this is a little aside. So now we're getting quite good at this. There is one problem, and this came out, this is the Sunday paper in England this weekend, and these were a lot of people complaining that their 90-year-old grandmother had died, and they'd rang the EMS and they were told to do CPR on them. And so as we're getting better at encouraging people to start CPR, we've also now got to start working on making sure people who were known to be dying or were expected to die, their family don't ring the EMS, who then encourage them to start CPR before the ambulance arrives. So that's a potential issue that needs to be addressed, and it's something that in the UK we're starting to work on, and we've just started this project of recommended summary plans for emergency care and treatment, where we're working with ambulance services, general practitioners, and so people who have, who are expected to die or who don't want CPR, and their families know what their wishes are at the end of life, so they don't get CPR or emergency treatments. Okay, now, this is something the ERC is doing and most countries in Europe are doing, measuring to improve. So you can be doing all these interventions, but unless you're measuring it, you don't know whether you're working or not. So whether they're working or not. So the ERC has a Eureka project. I'm going to talk specifically about the UK data. So we have an out-of-hospital cardiac arrest outcomes group led by Gavin Perkins, hosted by Warwick University, with lots of bodies funding it and lots of very good people involved. And this is now collecting data from all the cardiac arrests in England. So the population's 55 million. We get 30,000 cardiac arrests each year. The survival varies quite a lot according to the region, 5 to 10%. And our data shows similar findings from all other countries that have big registries, in that time is the key, and if you get bystander CPR, it's witnessed, and you have an AED used, survival is much greater than if you just wait for the EMS to come. So that's the current UK data. But I think the really exciting work, and it's being led by Terry Brown, who's going to be doing some posters, and there's other talks from the group, is on actually mapping all these arrests in much more detail. So you probably can't see this in detail, but this is a map of density of cardiac arrest, and this is density of bystander CPR. So the darker areas have the highest bystander CPR rates, and we can get it down to quite small areas. And what we can do is also, using that map, highlight those areas that have the biggest discrepancy between bystander CPR and incidents. So these are the areas where we probably need to target our training or have a look exactly what's happening. You know, why are they getting a lot of cardiac arrests but not much bystander CPR? So we can hone down on that with this data, and that's work in development, and we can do that on a national scale. Hopefully we'll save more lives by very targeted interventions. Just to say, the Canadians, so Laurie Morrison's group in Canada, are already quite hot on this. So this is Toronto, and they've mapped all the cardiac arrests, and they've also mapped all the coffee shops. And so the top location for an AED would be Tim Horton's coffee shop, because most cardiac arrests occur within less than a minute from it. And so if they put an AED in all these coffee shops, they'd be having an AED located next to the majority of cardiac arrests. I've only got a couple more slides, so just to say, this is the UK data. Bystander CPR rates are improving, but we're not quite there with Seattle or Norway, maybe Copenhagen, which is scoring. So there's still a big gap. So if everybody got to the level of bystander CPR or AED use as the best places in the world, there'd be a lot more lives saved. So the adjunct for most people is just catching up with the best. Yeah, there's no extra kit needed. It's all systems and organisation. So in England, and I know other countries have done this, Scotland has one, Wales has one, we've got a national framework document now that covers a lot of the things I've spoken about. You know, oops, what's happened there? Sorry, I'm going to have to go back to the slide. So Resuscitation to Recovery, a national framework document that goes on how we can strengthen all these links to improve recovery and outcomes. So when I went to the website of this meeting, I actually saw Society Saving Lives. How can we save lives by empowering an entire society to work together? So that actually is a strap line for this meeting. So it actually fitted with my lecture quite well. So hopefully, when you go to other lectures, other sessions, you can fit in all the little bits of a chain of survival that work for where you are and your area. Because in my view, the best adjuncts are invisible to the end user. You don't know all the planning that's gone on behind. All you've done is turned up with your phone, your hands, you ring the emergency dispatcher, they tell you where the AED is, the drone arrives, the ambulance arrives, and all the planning behind that should be invisible to the end user. So very systematic, targeted interventions. We're measuring them and improving them, so we know where the problems are, so we're going to focus in those areas. We're going to make lots of small games, and the key to me with all this is it's got to be all time-saving, so it's early and effective to save lives. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Josh. And again, the question, the urgent questions to Josh, if yes, please use the 2 microphones which are in the auditorium. It seems that also his talk was perfect and very clear. Nevertheless, I'd like to ask the 2 previous speakers to come back to the stage again. And let me ask a question to all 3 of them to give you a kind of take-home message. When you are taken into account what you have heard here by your colleagues and what you have presented, what would be your short statement or your vision for basic life support in the next 5 to 10 years?
Do you want me to go first?
It's up to you to decide.
Okay, more bystander CPR, more AED use, more life saved.
Well, he stole the thing, didn't he? So I'll have to say the same thing, but in a slightly different way. So every patient that sustains an out-of-hospital cardiac arrest where resuscitation is viable receives prompt bystander CPR and rapid defibrillation when required.
Well, I cannot agree more with more bystander CPR, no doubt, is triple survival. What I could say differently is that try to increase in your communities bystander CPR and AED locations and so forth, but keep researching also other ways to help better the quality of CPR and so forth.
Okay, thank you very much. Oh, one question. Can you please go to the microphone?
Hello, hi, Jazz. I've just recently left the NHS in the UK after a long career in cardiorespiratory physiology and more recently as a resuscitation officer. I'm now, as I say, retired, but I'm working in a voluntary capacity. I go to the local pub, I put adverts out through Facebook, get them into the local pub, and we've trained about 200 local residents in BLS and AED. You've just confirmed for me that my retirement is being put to good use. Thanks very much.
Okay, that's great to hear. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so it was a pleasure for me and I think also for my colleague to chair this session. You know what you have to do. Go out to your communities, talk them what you have heard, train them in basic life support. And beside this, I would like to, again, thank you for being here and enjoy the breaks. Thank you very much. It's a little bit.